am Ashley Landess, and I'm the president of the South Carolina Policy Council, and we appreciate you all being here with us today. When we started the process of looking into how government operates and what the dollars are being spent on, we discovered we had a lot more questions than answers. And you have seen a push over the last year for more transparency and more open government, just to put the facts and figures on the table. And obviously one of the most important things we study is the state budget. This report is the first step in analyzing the full picture of state spending, how the money is spent. Most importantly, the fact that we actually spend 3 times what is often reported. State budget isn't around $6–7 billion, as most people believe. It's actually about 3 times that, when you include categories like other funds and federal funds. What we wanted to do with this report was take a look at the categories of spending and ask some questions, particularly on the other funds category. It's important in budget cut times and when we're trying to communicate priorities as citizens that we know every dollar of spending that should be on the table. So the questions that this raises, and it does raise a lot of questions, why do we have $7 billion spent offline? And how much money is being spent by Washington? Because frankly, the biggest chunk of South Carolina state spending comes from the federal government. And that's something that we need to explore as a state. We need to open up the budget, take a look at the numbers, and this is our first step in doing it. And I very much appreciate Governor Sanford being here today, because over the last 6 years, he has raised so many of these questions and talked so much about the priorities for spending and the need to analyze them as a people. And hopefully we can all come together and do that and get a grip on the spending, open up the doors a little bit, and have a conversation. And I invite Governor Sanford to come up and talk to us a little bit about that.
I'd like to, but I'm here in support of what you're doing. I figured you did have charts.
Sure.
Since you didn't, I just called.
No, we don't need charts. We really don't. I'm good with the numbers.
No, but I do. And so I just called and asked somebody to run from the office with a couple charts. They're like, so Tom, you might go ahead. Maybe my
well, why not? Yeah, and I'll go through some of the figures here just quickly. What you see is the general funds around, and this is on that if you look at around $7 billion in appropriations for last year. And obviously the budget cuts come into play, but we wanted to make sure we're comparing apples to apples in this. So. And then another $7 billion in other funds. Key about those other funds, what we're asking about that is, all right, what triggers the other funds? It's a complex mixture of old statutes and provisos in pages and pages and pages that you literally have to dig through to see where 1/3 of the state money is being spent. And that doesn't make any sense. And this is one of the most important things that we wanted to do. This is fee money, it's fine money, it's money from sale of publications and licenses, and a lot of revenue sources that are very difficult to track down. That's one of the toughest things about analyzing the budget, and you all try to do it. And that is to look in and say, well, you know, how much are we actually spending, and where do we get information located in one source? So if you really want a one-stop shop, to get your hands on what triggers all of the funding and how are all the dollars spent, there's really not a place to get that. You have to dig a little bit too deep. So I want you to know that over the course of the next several months, we are going to be going through every agency. We're going to look at where the revenue is coming from, and we're going to look at where the funds are being spent. We're going to put that information up on our website, and we're going to start to have a conversation. And I guess I would be clear about this. No matter where you believe dollars ought to be spent, you have to agree that no one can make that decision in a vacuum. And we don't have enough information right now to even know as a citizenry what we want to spend. When you're cutting teachers, furloughing law enforcement officers, and there's $7 billion in funds that appear not to be debated, I think we have some tough questions. So I know Senator Davis has some things to say, and we appreciate you coming over, Senator.
Thanks, Ash. Recently transitioned from the executive branch, where I served under Governor Sanford in varying capacities, last as Chief of Staff. And in that process, grappled with executive budgets and tried to get my arms around the amount of money we spend in the state and trying to prioritize programs. And one of the things that I learned early on in the process was that we were only seeing a small fraction of the pie. that we were presented each year or charged each year with providing a budget in regard to the Appropriations Act, which was traditionally around $6–7 billion. Was $7 billion last June. I think it's been cut now down to $6.
Right.
And I quickly did some inquiries around about the budget and found out that actually our budget was $21 billion, and that effectively, each in thirds, roughly. You had the General Appropriations Bill, which we all look at and analyze ad nauseum. You've got another $7 billion that essentially is spent by default. It's spent in accordance with statutes that were passed years ago. It's spent in accordance with regulations that have been promulgated by agencies. And it's also spent to a lesser degree by provisos that are passed by the General Assembly. And when I ran for office and in my campaign, I started talking about the budget. And I always started the conversation by saying, how much money do we spend in South Carolina? And people would raise their hands and invariably say $7 billion. And when I told them that it was $21 billion, jaws started to drop. And when I then broke down exactly what that $21 billion was comprised of and explained that $7 billion of it comes under no scrutiny whatsoever, people started to get angry. And so I worked with Ashley and said, how can we bring transparency not only to the $7 billion, now $6 in the General Appropriations Project, but how can we go ahead and shine some light on these other fees? And I think one way that we can do that, quite frankly, is first of all by acknowledging, and it's almost like the 12-step process in AA. You start by acknowledging you have a problem. And our problem here is we don't know how that $7 billion is spent. Senator David Thomas in the Senate is showing great leadership in this regard. He's chairing an ad hoc committee to try to get his arms around this $7 billion of other funds that isn't accountable. And he's working very hard on that. I think one of the things we can do, and I'm going to talk about it with Senator Thomas and my colleagues, is put a moratorium right now on all fees increases, all license increases, all publication cost increases, because that will bring them to the table, explain what they currently charge, explain where that money goes, explain why they need the increase in the money, and at least as a starting point of identifying where all these pockets of money lie. So I think that's one useful thing we can do. A second useful thing we can do is this, is increase public input into the process. Now, just last night in Beaufort, I held a forum that about 350 people attended. And we had a 2.5-hour debate on how do we pay for new schools in Beaufort. And there were those that think the current system of taxing everybody through property taxes was a good idea. There were some that thought that maybe allocating the cost of growth to people coming into the area was a good idea. I'm open to that argument, either side. But the point is, you get the citizenry involved. And what I was struck by is, we have an incredibly smart number of people in Beaufort County who care about this state and who have things to share. And so it makes sense to me that if you're talking about transparency, so far we've had a debate about holding legislators accountable for their votes. Great. The House and the Senate have made great strides with the leadership of the governor, the Policy Council, and Nikki Haley and Nathan Ballantyne. We've gotten that piece in place. What I'm talking about now is getting transparency in place before we spend money, before we spend the money. And one way we can do that, I think, is when the budget comes out of Senate Finance, we go ahead and have a 72-hour cooling off period. We don't immediately start to debate that on the floor. We put it online. We make it easily accessible to the public. We give lawmakers the ability for a week's time to go ahead and get input from the citizenry, and you open that process up. So I think one thing we can do is have a 72-hour cooling off period so that we don't jump right into a floor debate on the budget when it comes out of Senate Finance, but we have time for the citizenry to become educated as to what those appropriations are and what input they can provide so the legislators can represent their constituents. So that's the first thing I would say is a response. The second thing, as I indicated, was this whole idea of a moratorium on these new fees. I mean, I've already heard agencies that are doubling and tripling fees to pay for services. And frankly, because there's not going to be general appropriations to help them pay. So the only other way they can do it is through fees and licenses and increased money for publications. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what they all are, but $7 billion is a lot of money. And if I'm going to be a representative for the people of South Carolina, and Beaufort in particular, I need to know that. And we need to have a public debate about that. Not just about the $6 or $7 billion in the Appropriations Act, but also in regard to that other third, that $7 billion. And Ashley is right. We also have to have a better understanding of where does this $7 billion in federal aid to states go? Where does it go? I mean, we're having 1/3 of our public policy in the state driven by Washington. And I don't think there's been any meaningful input on the state level as to whether or not that money's wisely spent, whether or not our matching funds are best spent in certain areas. We just haven't had that debate. We've been focusing on 1/3